I'm Trevor with Vanultra, and today we're going to jump into the installation on how to install these low-profile SUV tent mounts. Now, we have all the parts laid out in front of us, and in general, as a quick overview, we have the front and center mounts. These parts are exactly the same. We have all the tent bushings. These parts are all the same. We have the hardware that's going to attach the mounts to the crossbars. Back here, we have a set of rear mounts. These are the ones with the clamp. And we also have the lock housings and the key for the locks. So these are all the parts that are included. We also have the removable handle. That's not going to be used until the very end. I want to talk a little bit about the tools that are going to be required for this installation. Now, at a bare minimum, you're going to need a 13 millimeter and a 7/16 combination wrench. This is pretty common in most tool sets. Now, if you have a ratcheting wrench, this will definitely make your life easier. In some situations, you'll be able to use a socket and ratchet, but because of the nature of this roof rack and it being so low profile, you're most likely going to use a wrench. So if possible, try and dig out those ratcheting wrenches. The other thing that you're going to need is some anti-seize. Now, some folks will argue that this isn't actually required, but in our experience, the stainless steel hardware, so these are stainless steel bolts on stainless steel nuts. We see a lot of these parts galling up. And once they gall up, it's a nightmare to take apart. So we try and recommend on any stainless on stainless hardware, just to apply a little bit of anti-seize on there. And that way you can make sure those parts go together smoothly the first time and do not make a ruckus coming apart. Now, the other thing that will be handy is a tape measure. Now, tape measure is not going to absolutely be required in this, but it will make things a little bit easier so that you can get the tent and the mounts in the ballpark where they roughly need to be from the start, and have less trial and error. Now, jumping into some of the parts that we have here. So these are the front and center mounts. Like I said earlier, these are all going to be the same. Now, some of this hardware we have, I went through and pre-assembled some of these parts, but in general, we have a T-nut. Then there's a nylon spacer, a fender washer, and a split washer, and then finally the hex head. So order of operations when we're installing these mounts is first the hex head, and then we're going to do the split washer, followed by the fender washer, followed by the nylon spacer. Now what this nylon spacer does is that it actually drops into the pocket of this rubber bushing, this rubber pad here. And that way, when these fasteners are fully torqued down, we're not over compressing the rubber, but we actually have a nice good bite on the nylon, and that's going to be able to make sure that these mounts are nice and tight. Now, these drop-in T-nuts, these are going to be used in the next step. We're going to go ahead and drop them into the extrusion, and we'll go through those steps. Now, as far as going back to order of operations, what's going to be easiest? There's arguments saying that it doesn't really matter completely which way you go together. You could first start putting these bushings into the tent. That's going to be pretty easy. These are just going to slide in. So here we have the slider and then the bushing assembly. Those are just going to slide right into the tent, and these are all the same. They don't matter which orientation they go. And then we have the front and center mounts. Those are probably the easiest. Maybe start there and kind of understand how these parts go together. And then I'd probably reserve the rear mounts for the back, since those are a little bit more complicated. Now, the locks themselves can go on at the very end after the tent's been placed and the rear mounts are dialed in. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the installation. I'm going to start with the front and center mounts and installing them onto the roof rack. We're going to install the front and center mounts. Now, what we've learned with Sherpa and through our own testing is that we want to attach the mounts to a crossbar that's as close as possible to the feet or the attachment points of the roof rack. So for this 4Runner, we have a hard mount right here and a contact mount up here. So what we're going to do is we're going to attach to this crossbar that we've slid all the way forward closest to this attachment point, and then we're going to attach to the center mount that has this other foot right here. So as close as possible to the attachments to the roof. We're installing a stainless steel bolt into a stainless steel nut. Now, like I mentioned earlier, it's a recipe for galling. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply a little bit of anti-seize, just a dab. After the anti-seize, the next step is you're going to install these T-nuts into the extrusion. Now, these are the drop-in style, so you don't actually have to undo the crossbar. So they're going to just simply roll into the extrusion. Now, what you can tell is that we actually have, it looks like 4 holes, but there's actually 3 holes in this part. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be installing 2 in the diagonal position. Now, the reason that this 3rd hole is in here is for some roof racks that don't have 2 rails up top, but only have a single rail. For those installations, you're just going to use the 2 back 2. But if you have a double rail, like most of the roof racks, we recommend to use the 2 diagonal hole positions. What that means is you need to install a T-nut on one on each side, so the forward position and the backwards position, then line up these holes and install the hardware. These T-nuts have an offset hole. It does not matter whether it gets installed one direction versus the other. So this is just simply going to roll in. Okay, roll that in. There we are. With the T-nuts installed, you can drop on your plate. It's easier just to do one hole at a time. This nylon spacer is going to drop into the hole, and then I'm going to take the washer stack up and fastener and drop it in. And it might be a little tricky. Just have to spin it. There you go. So that one is in there. Now what you want to do is get it so it's snug and then back it off slightly just so it can slide. Now I have this other hole in position, so I'm going to drop on the spacer, put it into the hole, and take the screw, drop it in, spin it. Now if you find that this actually went on pretty easy, make sure that if you slide the mount, there isn't a T-nut sitting down there. If there's a T-nut sitting down there, then it actually did not thread into the T-nut properly. You want to be able to make sure that it can still slide and move, because when we install the tent, we want to be able to position this and get it where it needs to go. So that one is done, and we can move on to the next. We're going to do the center mount next. It's the same process. Drop in the T-nuts, align the bracket, and install the hardware. If you find that the hardware, the bolt is not going in properly, what you can try doing is pop this T-nut and wiggle it around a little bit. Sometimes they have a little detent in them and they might sit at an angle. You're going to want to try and get it so it sits flush and is roughly centered inside the slot. With the tent mounts installed on the crossbar, we want to determine where they need to be spaced relative to the tent. So one way to do this is to take a measurement of the crossbars themselves, or the distance from one side plate to the other side plate. Take that measurement and record it. The next measurement that we care about is the center to center distance of the tent mounting rail. So for me, the tent's up here, and I can grab one mounting rail to the other. So for our example, the distance from one side plate to the other side plate is just over 47 inches. The distance from one tent rail to the other tent rail is about 23.25. So we're going to take those two measurements and do some simple math, and that's going to tell us what the distance is for this position right here. All right, don't be overwhelmed, but we're nerds and we love math, okay? So what we derived is a very simple formula. Basically, the two dimensions that I talked about earlier, the first one is the crossbar width, or the distance from side plate to side plate. We're going to call that y in our formula. The other dimension is x. X is the distance between one mounting rail to the other mounting rail. If we take those two dimensions and subtract them, then divide by 2, then we'll get this distance d. Or calling the distance d the distance from the side plate to the center of that mount. For us, that's going to be right around 12 inches. So with our math, it's just under 12 inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from 12 inches from this side plate to the center of this mount. And now this dimension can be used for all of the mounts. So I can position everything where it needs to be ahead of time. And I'm still going to leave it loose for final adjustment, but at least out of the gate, I'm really close and the tent's most likely going to be centered on the first start. The rear mounts are going to be installed the same process. There's 4 fasteners as opposed to 2. The other thing worth noting is the direction of the arm. You want the arm to swing towards the center of the vehicle, and the main reason is because when you come in with the extension, you're going to have more travel if you swing towards the center as opposed to the outside. If you swing to the outside, you're going to be limited by the side plate of the roof rack. As before, I'm going to install a little bit of anti-seize on these fasteners because it's stainless on stainless and I don't want any galling. So I'm just going to take a small dab and put it on the tip of the fastener where it goes into the T-nut. Remember when I made you do some high school algebra? We're going to repeat that process and do that same distance D. So for us, it was about 12 inches. These 6 bushings are going to go into the tent mounting rail. Now, if you take these apart, it's not a big deal. The bushings are actually symmetrical, so it doesn't matter which direction they go. Before I install these on the tent mounting rail, I'm going to apply anti-seize to all of these bolts. After the anti-seize is installed, you can go ahead and reinsert the nuts and then install them onto your tent. This step can be done before installing the mounts, as it doesn't really matter, they're independent. Now if you have option A, you're going to get this same rectangular washer. If you have option B, the washer is just going to look a little bit smaller. And option C is going to have a hex head bolt. That's the main difference between the options. And for reference, if you end up changing tents and need to move to a different option, we sell different hardware kits that are fairly inexpensive for you to be able to reuse the mounts with a different setup. Now that these are ready, I'm going to go ahead and insert them on the tent mounting rail. For us, the tent is up here, so I'm just going to slide them right on. You're going to go ahead and install 3 per side, and you can get them roughly adjusted. They're going to be one in the front, 1 in the middle, and 1 in the rear. When the tent's getting lowered, you don't want these to get bound up and put any weight on the crossbar or onto the mount. So you do want them slid back behind the mount. With the bushing assemblies inserted into the tent mounting rail, go ahead and take your 13mm wrench and tighten them up. Now you don't want them to go fully tight, you still want them to be able to slide, but when the tent's installed on the roof rack, they're going to be really hard to access. So it's best practice to tighten them up ahead of time so that they're easy to get to. And then all you have to do is just get a final torque on them when they're in the correct position. One technique is to take these and go fully tight and then back off about a 1/4 turn just so they can slide. Now you can see we sucked up about a 1/4 inch worth of thread in there. And now for final placement, all I have to do is get about a 1/2 turn on these and they'll be fully tight. It'll make the installation way easier. We lowered the tent just above the rack, and now we can see with our line of sight all the mounts and the bushings. When you're lowering it, or if you're lifting it on and installing it, you have to be careful with these bushings. Make sure that they don't scratch up your rack or bend the brackets. Ideally, you want them back and out of the way. You also need to keep in mind where the tent's going to be. So for us, when this door opens up, there's a pole that goes in here, so we need to be far enough forward to clear all that. So we have this roughly where we want it. When the tent's getting lowered, I'm going to slightly align it and drop it into position. And then once the tent is resting on the rack, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift up 1 corner at a time and slide the bushing inside the bracket. Now, the center is going to be the hardest to be able to tighten. The good part is once you do it once, you don't have to do it again. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to do the rear and the front and get those tightened. We're going to tighten down the mounts, so the bolts holding on the mounts, and then tighten up the bushing. Then we'll go in and adjust the center mounts. This next step may not be required for everybody, but for this 4Runner, if I remove this rear crossbar, it makes reaching in and tightening up these fasteners so much easier. I've done it before with this crossbar installed, And I can reach my arm in here and tighten up these nuts. However, with this crossbar removed, it's so much easier just to be able to reach in. So I suggest being able to remove your rear crossbar. Now, to do this by myself, I typically throw some rags down here so that the bar doesn't drop onto the roof rack. Now, earlier I didn't mention a tool for this. Most of these are going to use quarter 20 fasteners, which is going to be a 5/32 Allen key, which is not metric, it's standard. I'm going to go ahead and remove it now, and then that way when the tent's installed, it'll be a lot easier to go ahead and access those mounts. We're spoiled with our vehicle because we have a sunroof. With the sunroof, we can easily reach in and access these front mounts. Now, if you don't have a sunroof, that's okay. You're just going to have to remove your front fairing. We're going to go ahead and show you how to do that in case you don't have a sunroof. To do that, you're going to want to remove the bolts that hold on this crossbar. You might have a different design, but essentially remove whatever is blocking you from accessing these front mounts and being able to tighten them with a wrench. So we're showing you through the sunroof so you can see what the process is. This bushing needs to get installed inside the bracket. Now, I know the bracket's fairly centered, so the front of the tent needs to shift over. And then I'm going to lift the tent up and slide the bushing into the mount. So first step is to slide the tent over a bit and then slide this bushing into position, just like that. Before tightening anything up, you need to make sure that the tent is centered left to right where you want it, but that's the process. If you don't have a sunroof, you're going to have to reach in where the front fairing is, and that way you can access it. This is a little bit harder because you can't see what's going on, but you can feel it. So for demonstration, I'm going to show you what that process would look like. Before tightening anything, make sure the tent is centered side to side. Also check your front to back. Make sure things like your rear hatch can open and swing into the right position. Now, once you know where the tent is, what we're going to do is we're going to reach in and tighten up the mounts, and we're going to tighten up the bushing. With the tent centered and front to back where we want it, we can then tighten up the mounts. Now for me, I'm going to start with the front mounts first. You're going to take your 7/16 wrench and tighten up the two hex bolts that are holding on the bracket. So one's here and the other one is on this side. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you don't have a sunroof, you're going to have to reach in from the front fairing and tighten these. It looks pretty doable because these are pretty far forward. With the two bolts holding the mount tight, then I'm going to move on to the bushing. Now make sure that the bushing is all the way forward and completely seated inside the mount before tightening. I use a 13mm wrench to fully tighten this. The rear mounts are a little trickier than the front. One of the reasons is because of the lock housing. Now, the fixed handle on the latch is going to swing in and need to go into the pocket of this lock housing. Now, the lock housing itself slides into the tent mounting rail. For our setup, we had to move the rear crossbar about 2 inches further forward. That's because the end of the tent mounting rail, it leaves just enough room for the handle to slide into this pocket. So once those have been kind of checked, then the next thing is to tighten everything up. And the process is the same. If you simply lift the tent up slightly, you can slide the bushing assembly straight into the mount. Once the bushing assembly is inside the mount, then you're going to use that 7/16 wrench and tighten up the hex bolts that are holding the mount down. Then finally use the 13mm and tighten up the bushing. The center mounts are difficult to install just because of the lack of access. So that's why we recommend doing the front and then the rear mounts. Get those tied in. Now with the rear mounts, what we noticed is you can actually just reach in and tighten up 2 of the 4 bolts. And then with the tent off, you have much better access and you can go and tighten up those last fasteners. With this center mount, what we did is we lowered the tent on and got everything happy with the front and the back. With the sunroof, we were able to reach in and manually slide in the bushing. We also were able to slide using a removable tool. We were able to reach in and push this bushing into the right spot. Now, it's important to try and get the bushing seated inside the bracket and get the left and right position where it needs to be and then tighten it down. So what we had done is we had pushed the bushing with the tool from the side, slid it into the mount, and then what I did is I reached in through the sunroof and tightened up one of the bolts. Now with the tent off, I can easily tighten up that other bolt. To set the position of these middle bushings, after the mounts are in place, simply take your tape measure and measure the distance from the front mount to the middle mount. So by doing this, I can get a measurement of 27 3/4. By taking this front bushing and measuring to the second bushing, I can adjust this to that same measurement. Then when the tent slid into position, I know that's going to be butted up in the right spot. Now there is some wiggle room because this part is slotted. Now if the center mount is not fully bottomed out, but actually is maybe a 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch away, that'll be okay just because this part's slotted. The front mounts and the rear mounts, I recommend to try and get the bushing fully seated. We've found that this little shorty 13mm wrench makes life a lot easier because it's so close to the rest of the clamp assembly, there's not much room. So one of the other things is it's easier if you spin this towards you and tighten it up just so that this bracket can spin. Once it's that tight, spin it into the proper orientation and verify that the clamp can still align properly. Engage the lock, everything looks good, unlock it, and do that final torque.